Hey everybody, I'm Peter Chittum, and this is Lightning Message Service. I am on the developer advocate team here at Salesforce, and this talk is just to give you an overview of what the Lightning Message Service is, what you'd want to use it for, why it exists, how it works, and kind of very much the broad overview of this relatively new technology in the world of Lightning Web Components and Salesforce front end. Before I get going, though, I definitely want to pause for a moment and say a big thank you to all of the sponsors of London's Calling who have made this whole conference possible this year. Very excited to be back to speak again here and talk about kind of a cool new technology that Salesforce has put in place. My social information is there, including my GitHub account, and as well as that, of course, my Twitter handle. I also put my email address up there, and if you want to get in touch with me, I welcome any kind of contact at any time. And with that, let's move on to this very important slide that simply states, as an employee of Salesforce, a publicly traded company, should I make any forward-looking statements, please don't use those statements to make any purchasing decisions. Simple as that, and time to move on. So this is the agenda today. I want to go through a little bit of an introduction to Lightning Message Service, set the context for what that is. I've got a demo after that to go through a couple of implementations that we've done of this, to showcase how this works and for you to go and see the code in a sample application. I'm then going to come back and talk about one particular feature of Lightning Message Service called scoped messaging, and I'll go back and do a brief demo about that, and then we'll do a little wrap up after that. So Lightning Message Service essentially is a piece of functionality that is in the Salesforce Lightning user interface, and it was meant to be a replacement or the next generation of a front-end messaging service that could replace the Aura event functionality, since that was never implemented in Lightning Web Components. So it's really about being a client-side event bus that talks between DOM branches, and I've got a nice little diagram to illustrate that if you're not sure what that means. One of the principles also was that LWC Aura and Visualforce would be treated as equal citizens. So in other words, this feature would allow you to use Visualforce pages, Aura components, and Lightning Web Components in the Lightning front end. So, and then there was another principle called don't be surprising. This has to do with scope and also has to do with one of the ways that the old Aura event service used to work. And I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So as far as communication between branches, this is just a nice little diagram to illustrate what I am talking about with this. If you think how the DOM is structured for a particular web page, you have elements that are sub-elements of other elements, etc. And the standard and custom event functionality of ECMAScript allows you to dispatch an event from some element down the tree and have that bubble up the tree and then be consumed by some element above it. So that works really, really well when you are working within a particular DOM hierarchy. However, if you have a very complex DOM structure, which the Salesforce UI is, and you need to send a message between those distinct DOM branches, or maybe even between separate windows under certain circumstances, in that instance, you may need to do a little bit more work. And Lightning Message Service is to make that work easier for those of you using the Salesforce front end. So you can see here that I've got an element over here that's publishing a message, and then some element over here might be consuming that message, might have subscribed to it, and then could respond to it. That's the whole idea around communicating between DOM branches. Now, to illustrate this further, if you really look at how complex the Salesforce user interface is, and this is a console application in Lightning Experience, there are all of these different tabs. There are sub-tabs. There are pop-up windows that have been spawned from the utility bar, and a lot of these different things. If you want communication to happen seamlessly between different parts of the Salesforce UI, you either need to do a lot of work yourself, or we need to give you the tools to do that. And that is really the purpose of Lightning Message Service. And as I said, LWC, Aura, Visualforce were all meant to be treated as equal citizens. So this is the implementation I'm going to show you. This is in the Lightning Web Components Recipes app in our Salesforce sample app gallery. And you can see that what I did when I built these was to build essentially identical publishers in all three UI technologies, identical subscribers in all three UI technologies, all of them either publishing to or subscribing to the same events. So one thing that could happen in any of those publishers would publish to all of the subscribers that you can see there. One additional thing that I did was to show a couple of different implementations in Visualforce, and I'll talk about that when I get there. Speaking of that, I'm there. So let's go and jump in and take a look at a quick demo and talk through this implementation in the Lightning Web Components Recipes app. If you're not familiar with the Salesforce sample applications, I highly recommend going and checking those out. Those are particularly useful to get to know different features of Lightning Web Components. Now, first thing, let's take a look at this in the front end. So what does this look like to an end user using this particular application? And what you can see here is a standard Salesforce Lightning application. All of these tabs correlate to different features that we've tried to implement very basic functionality. That's essentially what a recipe is the minimum number of lines of code to showcase a feature. And this message service tab right here allows us to see the message service at work. And what you can see is those three publishers at the top, one LWC, one Aura component, and one Visualforce page. And then we have all of the subscribers down below that. Again, one LWC, one Aura component, and then one Visualforce page that is using the remote object functionality. And then another one that's using the classic Visualforce partial page refresh post-back action functionality. And if I select any of these items here in the publishers, so again, each time I select one, it's sending an event. And then all the subscribers rather, are picking up that event and then responding to it. And that brings us to kind of the core piece of how does the Lightning message service work? The thing that you create is called a message channel. So all of these publishers are publishing to a single message channel, all the subscribers subscribing to a single message channel. And let's go and take a look at how that is implemented. So I'm going to walk through the code for these components. I'm going to then go back and talk a little bit about scoped messaging and how that's a little different from what you see here. And then I'll come back and finish up with that. Now, each of these components, as we said, is meant to be the minimum lines of code to implement a particular feature. Now, we could have just done something where you sort of publish an event that doesn't do anything. But as a choice, as an implementation choice to make this more relevant, we wanted to make sure we were interacting with the Salesforce server. And so what happens in each of these cases is, for instance, this is my publisher web component. And you can see here that we're iterating over a list of contacts and that there is a key for each of those contacts. So when I then select one of these, and there's actually this subcomponent here, contact list item bubbling, there is an event that is sent up the DOM and then executes this handle contact select feature of the web component class. And if we take a look at that, we can see that there's handle contact selected. Now we go and we grab the contact ID for this, we add it to a payload, and then we publish this. So that's essentially the action that this component is taking. Now let's take a step back and understand a little bit better how it's taking that action. First off, the thing that is wiring up Lightning Message Service is this import of Lightning Message Service. And there are two pieces that we are going to pull from that import. One is the publish API. So this is the function that's actually going to publish to the message channel. And then the other is called message context. And message context is important because it's what's going to tell this publisher component about the actual message architecture or the Lightning Message Service architecture that it's connecting to. So that basically says there's a Lightning Message Service engine. It's also going to allow it to stand up all the resources that the message service publisher needs. It's going to tear them down when the component is destroyed, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the other thing we need is the message channel itself. And you can see here that that's what this record selected channel is. So record selected C is just a little bit of metadata that you define in your org that defines the message channel. Message channels need to be unique. They sort of look by name. They kind of look like a custom Salesforce object, but please don't confuse that with a Salesforce object. This particular thing, apart from the metadata that defines it, nothing about this happens at runtime on the server. This is all client-side functionality. And if we have time a little bit later, we'll see, I can show you how I created that message channel. However, it's very well documented, pretty straightforward, and it's just a little bit of XML. So that's how our publisher works. Let's go take a look at the subscriber. Now, nothing too important here in the subscriber markdown. So the template itself is just, whatever the contact is that's been selected, that's then put into the context of the runtime of this component. That's what we're going to display. And you can see the bindings here for things like name and phone and that sort of thing. So all of the stuff that's important is going to happen here in the JavaScript module. So again, we're doing an import of message service and message context as part of that again. And this is super important because actually subscribers do need to proactively subscribe to the message channel. So that's an extra step that needs to be taken, which I'll show in a moment here. They also need to unsubscribe, or else you're going to have sort of ghost subscriptions on the message channel, I guess is one way to put it. Now, with message context used in a particular way, you never need to worry about unsubscribing. We will take care of that for you. So message context is particularly important here in the subscriber example. And of course, we have the subscribe API. So that's actually how we do the subscription. A lot of the rest of this is about just dealing with the contact S object that we're going to use. So we're not going to worry about any of that. We just want to focus on the LMS part of the implementation. That's getting our record. And eventually we're going to get down to here with the wire adapter. We are going to pass in message context, and that's going to give us a message context object. Now, the important thing about that message context object is that when I retrieve it using the wire adapter, the unsubscribe is automatic. Now, the subscription, however, happens in this instance as I am, there we go. So when connected callback is called, in other words, as the component is being built up and is then added to the DOM, once it's added to the DOM, connected callback occurs, and we call subscribe to message channel. And that is where we actually call the subscribe API. We pass in the message context, the message channel, and then, of course, an event handler. That's, of course, super important that we make sure we do that. That's what's going to respond to the message actually being sent to the subscriber or being picked up by the subscriber. So that's kind of it. Now, alternatively, and part of the reason for breaking this out into its own separate function as subscribe to message channel, you may want to not always be subscribed. Like in this case, this component will always be subscribed to this message channel. You might want to have a component that maybe subscribes after a particular user action. Maybe you want a component to subscribe to different channels under different circumstances. So architecturally, the way you build your component could, might have the subscription not automatic on the creation of the component and adding it to the DOM. Rather, it could just be, based on some user action. We decided to just go for a real simple, as soon as the component is in the DOM, we're going to then do the subscription. And one note about that, you cannot successfully subscribe until your component has been inserted into the DOM. So you don't want to attempt the subscription any earlier in the component lifecycle than connected callback. All right. So there you go. So that's kind of the whole story with subscriber and publisher in the context of Lightning Web Components. Now, if you can imagine, all of those same types of features are encapsulated in the Aura component, the Visual Force page, et cetera. So I'm going to go a little bit faster through those now that I've gone through it the one time. But in all the cases, you're going to see kind of the same things where you will always see, something that is going to identify the message channel itself. So that's always going to be a requirement. Something needs to subscribe or publish, as part of the implementation of the component or the Visual Force page. So all of these other examples are going to kind of follow the same thing, but really following the patterns that make sense to that particular technology. So case in point, if I go and look at the Aura component, the first thing that you'll notice in the publisher is that message channel is actually in the markup of the component itself. And I think that's a really interesting thing where the implementers of Lightning Message Service really tried to match, how are things implemented in this particular technology in Salesforce. So I think that was a pretty good choice that they made. And you can see there's our message channel. Now, when we do the click, again, there's a handle contact select function. And if we go and take a look at that function, there's my handle contact select. We build the payload, and then we call publish, right? And remember that the message channel is all implicit and identified in the markup that we saw in the Aura component implementation. All right, so we fire our component, fire our message, and then we have to listen to it. So in this case, again, a really interesting thing that's specific about the Aura implementation, this is pretty much it. So the entire bit of the code that's related to LMS for this component is right here in these 5 lines or so, where, there's my message channel, record selected, that's just the identifier for this bit of markup. And then handle message is just going to deal with, what happens when we get the message. So we go out to the Salesforce server, we retrieve a contact record maybe, or maybe, because it is Lightning, it might just fetch it from the cache. So that's pretty much it when it comes to Aura. Very, very simple. And you will notice there is no explicit subscribe in the case of the Aura component. You are just always subscribed. So that was a choice that the implementers, the architects of this feature also went with. All right, and then let's jump into the Visual Force use cases. I'm not even going to bother looking at the JavaScript because you don't need to see JavaScript in this case that goes and retrieves the contact record. That doesn't have anything to do with LMS, but it is there if you want to take a look at it. Now, the way that I built these Visual Force pages is each Visual Force page has a static resource that correlates to its functionality. So just be aware of that. And I kind of tried to build that. I don't know that I would have implemented that way in a real life scenario, but I did implement it that way in this case, just because this was intended to be a sample application, and I wanted it to be really straightforward for people to follow that in this particular case, we have this feature. In this particular case, we have this feature implemented this way. So each Visualforce page has its own static resource that contains the logic that we're following. So the implementation in Visualforce, let's pop back to that page. First of all, the first thing is that the message channel is a global variable. So how do I get access to the message channel in the case of Visualforce? Well, there is a binding in the Visualforce page itself that is going to bind to the message channel that we want to either publish to or subscribe to. Now, this particular implementation is using the remote contact object. This is the publisher, so this doesn't have anything to do with LMS, but this is some logic that I pushed into the static resource. And then there is the publish API. So in this case, sforce.1 is this feature that we make available in the context of Lightning Experience. One important thing in the Visualforce use case is that Visualforce is supported in the context of Lightning pages in desktop today. So there are still some limitations on Visualforce in mobile, for instance, and Visualforce in communities, I believe. So just take a look at the current limitations that are listed in the documentation before you go and try and implement this in your implementation. So essentially, we're taking the publish API, passing it to the static resource. We're taking the bound message channel and passing that to the static resource. And then the static resource just deals with, in this first case, publishing. So here, there's a handle contact selected. We build a payload, and we call that LMS publish, which is just a wrapper for the publish API. We passed in the message channel, right? So there's the message channel right there. And then there's the payload as well. Now, I probably could have simplified this and abstracted it a little bit less, but I did want to kind of keep to the idea of reusability a little bit in the context of this code. So that's our publish action. Let's go and take a look at the at a subscription example. Now, both of these are doing the subscription in pretty much the same way. The only thing that's different about these two Visualforce pages is one of them is going to use remote object to go and fetch the contact record. The other one is going to use a postback and partial page refresh. And I thought it'd be really interesting and useful to show both of those use cases in these examples because I know there are a lot of examples of both types of those pages out there in the real world today. So again, in our static resource, we have, and I didn't talk through this as carefully as I probably could have, but you can see here that we're, there's our LMSVF static resource, and then, there is the actual, that's the actual JavaScript file that we're getting from there. And so we go and grab a set page configs value from there, and then we set those page configs. Again, we have our message channel. Now, this is my action function, right? So in this case, we're doing the postback and the partial page refresh. And then there is my subscribe. So just like I did for the Lightning Web component, as soon as the Visualforce page is available in the DOM, I need to do my subscription. So let's take a look at how we did that. All right, so here, so on add event listener, ready state change, when ready state is complete, then go and subscribe to the message channel. So that is where we're doing the subscription. And again, there's kind of a level of abstraction here where subscribe to message channel passes in the message channel and then the handler, which is down here. And then that actually wraps the LMS subscribe call here, again, where we pass the channel and the handler. So part of the reason for this, again, was to have this subscribe to message channel be sort of abstracted away. Maybe you would want to have the subscription not be automatic every time, rather happen occasionally sort of thing. So there we go. Cool. So I'm not going to go through the last example of the visual force page for the remote object, mostly because it's pretty much the same. All the LMS stuff is the same, but I just want to make sure that you know that this is there in case you want to see an example that is using a remote object. And there are plenty of legacy visual force pages out there that I think might need the partial page refresh and post back example. There are also plenty of visual force pages that have implemented things like React and Angular, et cetera, some of these other third-party client-side frameworks. And so if you use the third-party client-side framework, there's a really good chance that you're using Remote Object or Visual Force Remote Apex. And if that's the case, then I think this example here is going to help you a little bit more as far as understanding how to wire up, what happens next sort of thing. Cool. All right. Good stuff. Let's go back to the slides. Awesome. So we want to talk about context. Now, context is really important in the case of Lightning Message Service because this is how Lightning Message Service distinguishes between these near root level DOM features. And when LMS stands up as a feature in the user interface, the context of a particular component is which branch of the DOM is it sitting in. And that's really important because that's essentially how the message service is going to kind of find that component in order to send a message to it. Now, the reason this is important actually has to do primarily with the subscriber itself. The subscriber, in some cases, will always be active. In other cases, it can basically turn off when the part of the DOM that it's on becomes inactive. So this has to do with scope. And scope, or scoped messaging, has two ways of being implemented. The default is active. And in active scope, any of the things you see in the light blue section there, those things are considered active scope. So some of these things are sort of all the time, like utility bar items and background utility bar items, Lightning tab components, and selected tabs. And this is really important. So if a tab is selected, like a console tab or a standard app tab or a console sub tab, right, that is active. Now, what that means is that if a console tab or a standard app tab becomes deselected, it shuts off. In other words, it goes quiet. The subscriber basically starts to ignore anything. It sort of temporarily unsubscribes would be another way of thinking about it. And then the way that you could get that to actually continue to listen is using what's called application scope. And you can see that application scope includes all of the active scopes as well as hidden console tabs, hidden console subtabs, and hidden standard app tabs. So, and there's one important caveat to this, and that is that until you visited that tab for the first time, it's not active. So what this has to do with is a tab that's been visited and then you've gone to another tab does actually remain in the DOM, and we can get a message to it provided it's been visited for the first time. So that's kind of the caveat there. And really it's for this reason that active is the default scope. And this was meant to address a problem that happened in the Aura event functionality where somebody wouldn't be on a tab, an event would fire that was an application event, and things would update in these tabs if they didn't expect them to. So that was kind of why this scope thing came up. In other words, try and use active scope. If you absolutely have to use application scope, understand that that part of the DOM needs to be visited at least once for it to be active. All right, and that takes us to the next demo. Cool. So here we are. And this is a little demo where I built some really, really simple subscribers and publishers just to be able to illustrate to people in a very visible way how exactly scoped messaging works. And this is just a single subscriber component and a single publisher component. And the subscriber component I've surfaced a property into App Builder so that each time I pop this component into App Builder, I can tell that component whether it's going to be application scope or whether it's going to be active scope, in other words, default scope. So, clearly this is a console application. If you remember from my earlier screenshot, that is what this screenshot is. And as I click around here, you can see that, so here is an account record, and there's my subscriber right there. That's a different account record. I can actually see a contact record as well. And each of these, so on the contact record, for instance, I decided to make my subscriber active scope. On the account record, I set it to application scope. And so what that means is any account record has an application scope subscriber, and any contact record has an active scope subscriber. So what that means is also is that if I am not actively on this contact tab, I would not receive a message. I shouldn't receive the message. Incidentally, I also went ahead and created a subscriber in my utility bar down here. And you know what? I'm actually going to make that a little bit bigger. Oh, so much better. So there's my subscriber in the utility bar. And I'm even going to pop that out. So it's actually sitting in a separate browser window. And with that, I'm going to start publishing some messages. So I'm in a contact record that's active scoped. And so I will say, this is my first message. And we'll publish that. And we should see everywhere this message has shown up, right? So this is that one showed up. I can see also in each of these account pages or tabs that shows up as well. And remember that whether popped out or just popped up or minimized, utility bar subscribers are always active, right? So in other words, if I pop this back in and minimize it, let's go back and publish another one. So now I'm in an account record, meaning that contact record, that contact publisher is that being active scope is not going to get this message. So we'll say this is my second message. And we'll publish that. And of course, each of my account records got the second message. There's Cheeky Media, there's my second message. But if I go and look at Bronwyn Ajax, still the first message is displayed. So that message was never actually received by this subscriber because being active scope and being on an inactive tab, it was asleep, basically. However, my active utility bar item did, of course, pick up that message because utility bar items are always active. So that's really the point of this demo, is to help people grok like what it means to have active versus application subscriptions. Let's also jump over and take a look at the code for this. And that is over here. Cool. So different application, different GitHub project as well. The first thing I want to show is that this is the property that I surfaced through App Builder, so that when I go and add the component, I can specify whether that component is going to be application or active scope. So again, as a useful thing, potentially you might want your you may have a component or a use case where somebody who isn't a coder who's going to be building that user interface needs to identify, is it always going to be listening, or is it only going to be listening when it's on an active tab? Cool. Now, if we take a look at the publisher, there we go. Nothing new here. So just like before, we have our message service. we have our message context, we have the publish API, and we have our message channel. So all of this is the same. The only difference is in the subscriber itself. So taking a look at the subscriber, you can see here that in addition to importing my subscribe and message context, I have also imported the application scope property. And what that means is that I've got a little bit of logic where if that is application scope has been set to true, then we are going to use scope application scope. And of course, in Visualforce, in Aura, there are corollary ways to accomplish this exact same type of functionality. And of course, if I've not set that to be application scope, then that last object isn't passed into the subscription. Simple as that, okay? So not super complicated, but again, just to illustrate how this works when we want to do scope-based messaging, if we want to do application scope, there's a little bit of extra work to do. All right. Always check the considerations and limitations. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier with the Visualforce stuff, but definitely at any time you're going to use LMS, it is still a relatively new piece of functionality. The team is still adding features to it. And so check to see, is it supported in the experience that you have? For instance, there are limitations on where you can use it full stop. And certain parts of it, like with Visualforce, there are limitations as well. So for example, Visualforce, it works in Flexi pages, in App Builder, in other words, and in utility bar items. However, it doesn't work in communities or mobile for Visualforce. Also, this is not meant to be a sort of easy, lazy replacement for the ECMAScript event functionality. If all you need to do is pass a message from a child to a parent, use the ECMAScript event features. In fact, I would say, even if you just have a simple Visualforce page that is going to pass it to a sort of parent, you do have to traverse the iframe boundary in that case. But I wouldn't suggest using LMS. I would just suggest using the post message feature that's available in JavaScript. So, always use the right tool for the job. And especially with LMS, it has a very specific purpose for it to be used. So just make sure you stick to that. I've got a bunch of resources here for you to take a look at. The code from both of those repos is available for you to jump in and take a look at and play with. I've just found a couple of bugs actually with the scoped messaging demo that should be fixed now. So if you do find any problems, if you're not able to deploy it, which is my problem yesterday when I was prepping for this, file an issue on the repo, let me know what you're running into, and let me know some feedback if you think it could be improved in any way. Quick takes are our new video series in the developer relations team. There are 2 quick takes that I've created that basically review this. So, definitely watch the London's Calling replay. It's much better, much more full. But if you just want the quick sort of 8-minute version of both Aura and Visualforce, go take a look at those videos. And then back in summer 20 was the first release blog posts of this. Go take a look at that blog post if you'd like to read more about it. If you've taken things by reading, it's a great resource to take a look at. But just bear in mind, it's obviously evolved since then. And with that, I thank you.